All right.
Okay. Well, thank you for the invitation to be here today, and had some good conversations already. I'm just excited to talk about this topic of accessibility with you. So I'm Jared Smith. I'm from WebAIM, which is the Web Accessibility in Mind project. We're based at the Institute for Disability Research, Policy, and Practice at Utah State University. So our offices are here at USU on campus. But WebAIM functions essentially as a nonprofit consultancy out of the university. We have worked with clients, all over the world. Just a few of them. I think WebAIM's been around for about 22 years now. So about as long as there's been web accessibility, WebAIM's been doing this work. And I think we're getting close to probably around 1,000 clients that we've engaged with over the years. This is just a few of them. I pulled out a few more local entities that we've engaged with. Our mission is to expand the potential of the web for people with disabilities by empowering individuals and organizations to create accessible content. So we don't come in and fix people's problems. We don't fix people's websites. We don't directly address the accessibility of other organizations. Instead, we provide training, we provide evaluation and testing, auditing services, consultation to help build and empower, provide a knowledge base for those organizations so they can build and maintain that accessibility on their own over time. So, again, WebAIM's been doing this for a long time. I'd encourage you to check out our website, webaim.org. We have just a wealth of resources and materials that we provide there. In our little breakout, someone asked about how we market, how we did our clientele. It all has really just come to us organically because of this community around accessibility that we build, and all of these free resources and materials that we provide. And we have really good, doodle juice, I guess, and that's just has really driven to us really more clients than we have the capacity to work with. So why do we do this work? Why are we passionate about it? Well, we know 20% of the population has a disability. That number holds up pretty well across the world. Whenever census data collects information about disabilities, about 20%. Over 1 billion people on the planet have or report having a disability. As we analyze those types of disabilities, about 8.5% of the population has a disability that can affect computer use. So you might look at that number and think, what does this mean for me? What is this maybe around 8.5? That's a pretty minimal number. It doesn't include cognitive and learning disabilities, doesn't include color blindness and a few things like that. One example of how this, I think, number can be impactful is actually Apple. When Apple released the iPhone, they built in accessibility into this device. If someone was blind, they could fully use and interact with this smartphone, which is interesting because it's entirely touchscreen driven. It's a really visual interface, but they made it very accessible to blind users. So if you were blind and you wanted a really cool smartphone, were you going to purchase an iPhone or a phone that you couldn't use because it was inaccessible to you? Of course, you're going to buy an iPhone. And we saw this really significant shift in the disability population to purchasing iPhones, and then iPhones and iPads, and now MacBook Pros and things like that. Android has come along and now has good accessibility, and others, but iPhone, Apple did it first. Maybe they were seeing dollar signs in that not only could they expand their reach to this 8.5% of the population, but they could absolutely get a stranglehold on that market. That 8.5% of the population, those with disabilities, would be purchasing their products because of that accessibility that was built into them. And so that's maybe one way to think about this is not just should we do this, but there really may be significant opportunities by providing accessibility for this population. So that's kind of an interesting way to think about that. But some of the results of this has been that, I've heard from blind colleagues that have said that the iPhone is the single most life-changing, impactful piece of technology they've ever had. I love my iPhone, but I don't know that I could say that. That's how impactful the accessibility of these devices and of digital resources and content can be on the lives of people with disabilities. When we talk about accessibility, it's important that we do focus on that user experience, because we're talking about a human experience and an experience that is extremely varied. We have a lot of different types of disabilities, and that kind of makes accessibility a continuum, a process that we're always striving to improve. Anytime somebody comes to me and says, yeah, my website's accessible, that doesn't really mean a whole lot, right? We have to quantify that. Accessible to whom, or accessible to maybe what guidelines or measures or standards. And fortunately, we do have guidelines along that continuum. You would kind of probably say the same thing about security, right? If security is something of concern to you, it's not like you do a security audit, you check a box and say, yeah, we did security, we don't have to worry about that anymore, right? Because the technology of security is always changing, and the same applies to accessibility, especially because we're talking about that human experience. So we do have these guidelines. The primary set of guidelines out there are the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, WCAG. I will probably say Wcag. This is a set of guidelines that was created by the World Wide Web Consortium, the W3C. They're the international standards body for the web. They define HTML and CSS and a lot of these technologies that we use to create the web. It's been around for a long time. 1999 was the first set of accessibility guidelines. They've been updated subsequently. The current version is 2.1. They're in process with a 2.2 and a 3.0 version of these guidelines. So they are, being updated as technology changes. The foundational principles of these guidelines are perceivable, operable, understandable, and robust. I think these are really good principles for us to think about as we consider that user experience and how we're engaging with people. Is what we're providing perceivable? Can the user get it to their senses in a way that can be useful to them? And if they do not have particular senses, if they're blind, if they're deaf, if they maybe can't use a mouse or keyboard, those types of things, can they perceive and engage? And then that's our next principle of operable. Can they interact and navigate within that? Is it understandable? Does it make sense to the user? And then finally, is it robust? Does it actually work in the technologies and the assistive technologies that people with disabilities might be using? So if we think about it at a very high level, those principles, I think they can help guide us towards a better end user experience. Now, there's a whole lot more to these guidelines than just those principles. We have a checklist on the WebAIM site that might be helpful to you. It just provides a summary of these kind of complex academic guidelines in a way. They're technical guidelines, but they can help give you a sense as to how to implement and how to measure a website to these accessibility guidelines. We also have legal requirements for accessibility. The real primary ones that we focus on, at least here in the States, are Section 508, which applies to federal agencies. While the law requires accessibility with the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines version 2.0 for federal agencies, we all know the federal government's a big behemoth thing, and so it tends to have a much broader applicability or scope. When you receive federal funding, or if you want to do business with the federal government, Section 508 is often a requirement. We also have the Americans with Disabilities Act, the ADA, which is civil rights law. It says you can't discriminate based on disability. Three important sections or titles within the ADA. One is employment. Just stress that you don't overlook employment. Be considering accessibility of your internal systems, HR systems, internet. If you maybe developed a disability, you went blind, if you could not do your job because of the inaccessibility of systems that you're required to use, does that sound like discrimination? I'm not a lawyer, but it kind of does to me. There's also a title for state and local governments and public and commercial facilities, which are public places where generally the public can congregate. That's what requires accessibility, like wheelchair ramps and accessible entrances and drinking fountains and theaters and shopping malls and things like that. The question for some time has been, is the web a public and commercial facility? Is the web covered by the ADA? And the predominant answer has been yes, that it is. However, we don't have technical accessibility standards defined in the ADA yet. So that kind of puts us in a bit of a nebulous place when it comes to ADA and web compliance or ADA compliance of websites. We don't exactly know what that means because we don't yet have those technical standards. However, when we see complaints under the ADA, lawsuits that are filed, they almost always reference those accessibility guidelines. And pretty much all of the other laws throughout the world in other states are going to reference or at least not exceed those guidelines. So that's kind of where it's at, is focusing on those guidelines. When it comes to lawsuits, we have seen a significant increase in lawsuits about digital accessibility in recent years. Predominantly targets of these lawsuits are like e-commerce type sites, generally smaller type entities, maybe because of the legal costs and defense that might be mounted in for larger entities. But we are seeing a lot of lawsuits around digital accessibility. So I think it's important to understand what the risks might be and how you minimize some of those risks and maybe increase user engagement when it comes to accessibility. One, I think that's important is that you do have accessibility requirements and that they're defined in policy. That's one of the first things from a legal standpoint that is looked at. What are you doing about accessibility? Do you have a policy? Do you have something that defines what your intentions or plans are for accessibility? And that's the next step. Then, create a plan to actually implement accessibility and measure that progress over time. Accessibility doesn't typically happen in a vacuum. There needs to be sufficient supports and training to have this happen, and involve users with disabilities and make sure that they can provide feedback on the things that you're providing, and really focus on that user experience, not just meeting technical requirements and checking boxes, but really providing a good, efficient, accessible user experience is the key. And then build a culture of inclusivity. If 20% of the population has a disability and 0% of your workforce has a disability, there's a significant mismatch. You would probably be asking those questions about gender or race or things like that if you had significant disparities. So building that culture of inclusivity really helps support accessibility efforts. I want to highlight one tool that may be of use to you. This is Wave. This is a tool that we've built. It's a web accessibility evaluation tool. So if you want to get a quick sense as to how accessible your website is, you can go to this tool, put in your website address, hit a button, and it'll provide visual feedback about detectable errors, which is not everything when it comes to accessibility, but things that even a computerized program can detect when it comes to accessibility. So that's wave.webaim.org. That's one tool that may be of use. I'm sure you're probably familiar with just this concept of the increased cost of change over time. Very often when we engage with clients, it's, we just launched our product, or we're going to launch next week. Can you help us with accessibility? And at that point, it really becomes more difficult because it's a remediation process. We're fixing issues, and it never seems to really, just is really hard to make that highly accessible. Whereas if we start very early in that process and define policy and requirements and implementation plan, and then review that and implement accessibility into design and coding, it just is much less expensive, and the end result is going to be much more accessible and ultimately result in a better experience for everybody. Including your own internal processes that can be much more efficient. Accessibility supports better search engine friendliness, internationalization. There's just so many additional benefits that come by implementing that accessibility, but optimally implementing it early. I want to end with this quote. For people without disabilities, technology makes things convenient, whereas for people with disabilities, it makes things possible. The web is really the great equalizer when it comes to people with disabilities. It allows people to engage in the ways using the technologies that are most convenient and possible for them. I like to bank online, I like to shop online, but I can still, I could go to my bank, I could go to a classroom to engage in education, those types of things. But for many with disabilities, that's not a possibility. The web is that possibility, and it's the equalizer that provides that. So you all of you have a great potential to notably impact and improve the lives of those with disabilities. So with that, I'll say thank you, and see if there are any questions or comments.
Jared, thanks so much. That's awesome. That was a great presentation. I didn't take down all of the websites from the presentation. Would you be willing to share the presentation with this group?
You bet.
Okay. That would be really helpful, because I think having some of those tools would be great. I'd be interested in, I've got a few questions, but happy to open it up to everybody else on the call with questions if you've got them first.
And all of those resources, tools, plus a whole lot more, they are available on the WebAIM.org website. And so that'd be the first place I'd point you to, is going out there. But yeah, I'm happy to share the slides.
I'm wondering actually if you wouldn't mind pulling up that website and just sharing with everybody like how you would use it. I haven't gone to it yet, so I don't know what it looks like, but I mean, could you run through a case study of checking a website for us?
Sure. Is there, are you seeing that now, this website? Make sure
Yes.
I showed the right screen there. Is there, I just maybe I'll ask, is there anybody that's willing to volunteer a website for me to do a little live analysis? We won't spend too much time. I promise not to be
This is helpful. I'd be interested if Jacob or Chad have one that they're working on in terms of the marketing or the SEO and how that would impact accessibility. Like if you two or anyone else has any examples, throw them out there. Unmute yourself.
I don't have any great candidates. If there isn't anybody else who wants to put one forward, we could use, the little website I use for CMO Zen. I think it has had a sum total of half a second of attention paid to accessibility. So it would probably be an embarrassing candidate, but maybe good in that regard.
Sure. I'm happy to plug in whatever, or I can just pick one. That's fine too.
Yeah, well, you can try cmozen.com, just cmozen.com.
Okay.
And I'm going to sit back and cringe, maybe stop the video.
Hey, this is actually pretty good. So what Wave does is it goes out and gets the web page and it visually presents the web page, and it injects icons and indicators into that page to give feedback about accessibility. And then the sidebar over here provides feedback. First thing of note, 0 errors. That actually is really good. We do an analysis every year of the homepages for the top 1 million websites. Average number of errors on the average homepage is like 58. Imagine that as a person with a disability. On average, you can expect to encounter 58 potential barriers to your experience. So 0, that clearly indicates there's been more than half a second of attention to accessibility. 1 contrast error. Alerts, here you can go to the details panel. The alerts panel provides additional things that maybe are not, it doesn't know for sure are an accessibility issue or barrier, but it prompts additional human assessment of that. There is additional documentation for any of these. So you can click on an icon and then go to reference or click in the sidebar, and it'll tell you what these particular icons and things mean. Really what Wave does is it helps facilitate a human accessibility process. So again, there's good documentation there, outlines accessibility features, structural elements, things that might be supportive of good structure and search engine friendliness and accessibility. There's ARIA, which is more advanced accessibility specific code. But we can take time and go through this, but I can tell already just looking at this that this is good. I mean, there's 0 detectable errors. Doesn't mean it's compliant necessarily, but the fact it didn't detect any errors. And from what I'm seeing here, there's good structure. There's headings. The language has been identified. There's alternative text for images, things like that. There are, these structures, header, main content, footer, things like that. They're all supportive of accessibility. So this is good. So this is the type of tool. We also have browser extensions. So you can do this on like internal pages, non-public password protected pages. We have more enterprise level tools as well. So if you want us to do, auditing of an entire website, we can do that as well. So.
That's really cool. Hey, Jared, so I'm glad that it wasn't as bad as I thought. But also, like, let's say that you want to get started and look at this. Is this the starting point for you as you're consulting with people? Is using this tool to highlight the maybe the glaring errors?
It's one of the starting places. The types of issues that can be detected by Wave and other automated testing tools tend to be among the most impactful for users with disabilities. And they're easy to detect. I hit a button on a web application and have it do that testing. So yeah, it's a good place to start. In fact, if all that people did was address the most common 5 or 6 accessibility issues that are detected by Wave, images missing alternative text for users that can't see that, they would hear that text in its place, low contrast text, empty buttons and empty links, so links that don't have any text that convey what the link or button does. Inputs that are missing associated labels, so like a text box that does not have associated text that would tell, say, a blind user what the functionality of that field is. If all we did is just address those issues, those 58 or whatever average barriers would go down significantly, and the overall experience would be great. So yeah, that's a great place to start.
Looks like Hallie dropped a couple websites in the chat. Maybe
yeah, there were a couple really good questions. If it's all right, I'd like to at least maybe jump.
Please, yeah, start with Hallie's up there. I think she came in first.
So the first question, as life returns to in-person, right, quote, quote, of course, how will neurodivergent and others with varying abilities fit into the expectations for less tech? It's kind of interesting with the pandemic. We think of all of those pains that we started to experience at the beginning of the pandemic as everything started to shift online, and people with disabilities are like, hello, that's been my life, right? These barriers and these technology difficulties, that's what I face every single day. I hope that many of the things that we've started to implement as part of the pandemic and a focus on, digital things and user experience and accessibility and all of these things have resulted in better experiences for those with disabilities. I see that. But yeah, now there's kind of that question as we go back, it's never going to be the way it was, but as we start to maybe transition back to in-person, then, are we maybe losing some of those benefits? What have we learned from this experience that can, in the long term, benefit those with disabilities? I think those are some really important questions. I don't know that I have the answers to them, but I think they're good ones for us to be considering. Next question there: what is the place for rehab doctors like me to become more involved in advocacy and recommendations at client, patient, and corporate levels? That's a good question. I think the big one is just awareness of this topic. I saw a recent study that showed that very, very few doctors actually have much of an understanding of accessibility or even disability. And so, I think just awareness of what this means, maybe the technologies and resources and tools that are out there can be helpful. So, at a minimum, just become an advocate. Even if you don't know exactly what all this means and how you fix it, just becoming an advocate for accessibility change is impactful. Okay, Taylor, are there website builder tools that are good for integrating accessibility to development? Yeah, there are some better tools out there. There's some really nice, like continuous integration, continuous development, testing tools. Wave has options for some of that. There are builder tools like backend type things. One thing we tend to see is that very often they are not very good with accessibility, and that can really tie your hands. It's a few things are more, I don't know, maybe frustrating than being tied into a system with your website that doesn't support accessibility, and you can't really do anything about it. You can't fix it. So it's important that you're starting with good tools, as you're maybe contracting with designers, developers, as you're procuring these types of tools, you're asking those questions about accessibility. We're seeing more of that. So a lot of these, tool vendors are putting in a lot more effort for accessibility, and that's having a huge impact, I think, more broadly. So yeah, asking those right questions.
Yeah, Jared, I'm just wondering, kind of a follow-up to that, like, are there tools like Wave, or does Wave do assessment on like emails or something like that? Because if I were to have Chad do an email campaign in marketing and sending it to 10,000 people, like, are there tools for that? Or if I were to go to Jacob and say, can you help me with my SEO, Are there tools that would help build the right buttons or the right links or anything like that in his work to help accessibility?
Yeah. Yeah. Good question. There are tools that can help support and test email accessibility. Unfortunately, with email, the technology limitations there's some limitations, right? To what you can do generally in email, and the same applies with accessibility. But most emails are just HTML, just fairly vanilla HTML content, and so it's you can readily implement accessibility into those. There is an overlap, not 100% overlap, but there is an overlap in best practices for search engine optimization and for accessibility. Ultimately, it's about good content, right? Search engines are trying to find things that are meaningful and useful for humans. That's what accessibility is about, is making that connection between what you have and that end user experience. And so there is a notable overlap there with things like alternative text and page structure and those types of things. So I think that's an area where we could probably better capitalize on some of those overlaps and the harmony there. But yeah.
Cool. Thank you. That's helpful. I think Hallie had a couple of sites that she's currently on.
Sure.
Holly, should we check those out on Wave?
Yeah, I can punch one or two in here. So this is the first one that you.
I'm just getting off the New York City bus, so I'll go back on mute and off video, but thank you.
Okay, yep, you bet. So here's the first one. So Wave here has detected four errors, 30 contrast errors. So I can go to details and then start to see what those are. For instance, here, this first one indicates it's a linked image missing alternative text. So the logo up here at the top, Wave is detected doesn't have alternative text, and so any content conveyed by that image would be lost. One of the real big ones here are the contrast errors. Now, visually looking at these, you might say, hey, this is white text on this dark background. It appears like it has sufficient contrast. This is being alerted because actually that background image behind all of this, if that image were not to load or were to be disabled, maybe by the user, maybe because of a cognitive or learning disability, this would actually be white text on a white background. And so simply defining a fallback color for that element. So if that image isn't there, there's a solid, dark background color to it, would address almost all of these issues. And so, on this page, again, it's two types of issues that are detected, both that are readily addressed with like a couple words and a little, like one line of CSS probably would address almost all of these issues that are detected. You want to go through the other one, or I'm not sure where we're at on time?
Yeah, we're coming up on time, typically where we end. So maybe just the last comment from you. I know you had in your presentation like some checklists or the 5 things that you could do if we were all to go back to our current websites. What would you say the first 1 or 2 things would be? Is it just checking it through Wave, or any other suggestions as we kind of go back to our companies and say, okay, how do we make things more accessible? And
Yeah,
maybe we'll close up.
Sure. Yeah, I think Wave is a great place to start just because of what it can detect and so readily, and it provides that documentation, and most of those issues that are detected can be readily addressed. Probably the next thing after that, I probably put 2 things in here, but it would be probably extending that testing a little bit more to keyboard testing. So if somebody can't use a mouse and they're using a keyboard, can they use that keyboard to navigate through that page and interact with things? Is it visually apparent where they're at? And then maybe also some screen reader testing. So using that technology used by users with visual disabilities to read that content to them. We do on the articles on the WebAIM site, we have details on doing that keyboard testing. We have these evaluation guides and lists of tools. We have articles for using the major screen readers that are out there. And so, just it can be a little overwhelming because there's a lot out there, but just taking some of those initial steps can really start to have a big impact.
Very cool. Well, that's super helpful, Jared. If anybody has any questions, what's the best way to connect with you or contact you?
Yep, it's jared@webaim.org, JARED @webaim.org, or you can go to the webaim.org website and just go to the contact list linked at the bottom, and you'll find me there. Can send a message via the website. Yeah, Taylor,
Can I
thank
get
you.
your email address correct in the chat?
Yep, that's it.
Great. Well, if you don't mind sending me your presentation, I can distribute it out to the group if that's easiest for you, but
Yeah.
really appreciate your time and thanks so much for sharing this with us. This is fantastic.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah.
Thanks, Jared.